Jack had no idea what to say to that, which was a shame because he'd often dreamed of women saying something of a similar ilk to him in the past. If only the context wasn't so shit, he lamented. What was he going to say? That he had no plans to get down with her because she'd probably fold him like a pretzel? Because he wasn't entirely sure she wouldn't be able to immediately figure out he wasn't a cultivator if they did the horizontal tango? Because he was absolutely certain that she'd figure out that he was a... My master, are you worried that I would discover that you're a human? The relative quiet of Jack's office was sundered, as the cheap aluminium table beneath him let out a rather distinct shriek, as his power-armored fingers tore through it like wet paper. It seemed that Arndt's latest question had caused his suit to shift into combat mode, or rather, the sensors on board his suit decided to do so after a sudden urge of adrenaline entered his bloodstream. Part of him wanted to turn it off immediately before he broke something else. Another, much larger part of him thought it wise to keep it on, lest this conversation turn unpleasant. Yes, he said finally. Perhaps he might have lied, but it seemed rather pointless at this stage. Somehow or other, Anne had figured out that he wasn't packing stray animal bits. Though that immediately begged the question as to whether or not she'd figured out that he wasn't a... Yes! The Catwoman positively gushed. I knew it! You're hail from outside the Empire's borders, right? That's why you're so unfamiliar with everything and use such strange techniques. Jack paused in the act of reaching for the quite literal hand cannon he had strapped to the underside of his desk. Indeed, he nodded hesitantly. Well, yes, that's exactly it. I'm a human from beyond the Empire's borders. He almost felt bad for lying as the Catwoman nodded eagerly. Was it that obvious? The gleam remained in Anne's eyes, but some small sheepishness twisted her lips as she gazed down at him. A little. She waved a hand in a so-so gesture. I'd had some small suspicions before, but the bottled play you showed the mortals the other night was what really clued me in. Luminous eyes twisted to regard him. Master, was it truly a work or fiction? Or was the tale of Men in Red based on real events? The latter, Jack said slowly. Do all lands outside the Empire have their mortals fight like that? Like you have the Jiangxi mortals do? Where were the cultivators in the story? Oh, were the Eastern tribesmen instinctive tribals? The words came forth like a deluge, and Jack desperately raised his hands to stem the tide. I don't know about the whole world, he said. I've travelled far, but the world is a big place. Weapons like the ones I'm creating here are quite common where I come from, though. He paused. As to why there were no cultivators in the story. His mind raced as he tried to come up with a plausible answer. Well, they tend to be more like me. Craftsmen and enchanters, then, rather than frontline fighters. And the Zulus in the story were just people. It was hard not to release a sigh of relief as Anne nodded at the words. That same excitement in her expression as she learned of the mysterious world beyond the Empire's borders. And it was a mystery, at least as far as the average peasant knew. While Lynn had confirmed that the Empire knew other societies existed outside the Empire's walls, given the presence of a number of ethnicities within it that could have only have come from foreign settlers, what those societies looked like were a mystery. Hell, not even those non-Asians whose migrant ancestors had arrived in the Empire knew exactly where those ancestors arrived from, at least beyond some vague myths that Lynn was ignorant to. To be honest, the whole had sounded more than a little ridiculous to Jack. How could a whole subculture forget where it originated from? Before he remembered that the walls of the Empire had been up for a good few thousand years, and in that time the human portion of the populace had gone extinct. With that in mind, the idea that some of the more ethnically diverse parts of the Empire might be a little hazy on exactly where some of the odd little traditions of their home came from was a bit more understandable. Fascinating, Arn breathed, ignorant of his little mental byplay, which was fine by him. Someone else might have felt guilty about lying so shamelessly. All Jack felt was relief that Arn still believed he was a cultivator. He honestly had no idea what she'd do if she discovered that to be another lie. According to Lynn, the most likely outcome was that she'd kill him for deceiving her, or at least make the attempt. And, despite his suit, he wasn't entirely sure she'd fail. Finally, she paused, turning to stare at him. Is it not normal for men to leave with women where you are from? In different circumstances, Jack might have found it amusing just how conflicted Anne sounded as she said those words. As much as he seemed horrified by the prospect, there was no missing the hint of curiosity in her eyes, at the possibility that his interests might not lie with women at all, but the immediate alternative. As it was, Jack found himself feeling more offended than anything else. For sure, he had no issues with anyone who was inclined towards their own team, but he was a red-blooded male, with a rather healthy appreciation for the fairer sex. Even if he'd yet to find an opportunity to indulge that interest since he'd found himself stranded in Fantasyland, or rather, he'd yet to find any opportunities that weren't either a result of tacit blackmail, or likely to land him in traction. No, he coughed. Ann leaned in towards him, intentionally or ignorantly exposing a rather enticing swath of sun-kissed cleavage. Certainly, Ann was hardly the most buxom woman around, but what she did have suited her svelte form right down the ground. Then why have you not made a move? The fact that it took Jack a second or so to pull his gaze up from that view only served to reinforce that he really did need to get laid at some point. Having spent the last 2 months mostly underground, optimizing production lines, hadn't done his self-control any favours. Why haven't you? He shot back, feeling a little defensive. Which he felt was only fair. He felt a lot like his pride as a man was being called into question here. It didn't help that the stunningly attractive Catwoman was asking a question he'd asked himself a number of times since showing up at the Empire. And the more he found himself being asked it, the more Jack found himself wondering if the very real possibility of a messy death, either in the act itself or immediately following it, was really the issue he thought it was. Ann actually flushed. It wouldn't be proper, she pulled back, seemingly realizing that she'd practically been leaning over his desk. I'm the student. My role is to make myself available, not instigate things. Like you are right now, Jack pointed out dully. The Catwoman flushed, before her features shifted to something closely resembling a pout. This girl Ann merely wished to confirm that her teacher was aware that she was available, should he desire to make use of her. Right, Jack deadpanned. He was pretty sure her words and intent had been a little different when she walked in here, but being a gentleman, he was willing to let it drop. Never let it be said that Ma didn't teach me nothing, he thought. The thought of the woman that had birthed him did serve to wipe some of the smile from his face. Well, as to why I've not taken advantage, the answer is in the wording. He tapped his desk. I didn't want to take advantage of someone who I normally held power over. Where I come from, teachers don't sleep with students. Decent teachers, at least, or so he had heard. Given Jack's only real experiences with formal learning had come from the Simpods, he was a little lacking in first-hand experience, but he liked to think he had a vague understanding of how the job was supposed to function. Even if a good chunk of that understanding had been derived from old Holovitz, and even older Flatvitz. Oh! Ann seemed a little taken off guard by that statement. Is it a matter of face? God, how Jack hated that word. Certainly it was useful, but it was also as nebulous as hell. Not quite, he said. It's more like a matter of personal pride. Given the way Ann tilted her head at his words, it seemed she didn't fully understand, which is fair, because he didn't fully understand it either. By all rights, he should have taken Lynn over a desk weeks ago, once it was clear she was no longer terrified of saying no to him. Some part of him continued to rebel against the idea, that he'd still be taking advantage of the power he had over her by pushing things in the cardinal direction. It wasn't like either of them were ever unaware of the fact that he held all the power in their relationship. You would not be taking advantage of me. Ann flustered slightly as she spoke, her words drawing him back to their conversation. My interest in you is not entirely the result of my position as your student. Jack cocked his head, a worried grin on his features. Really? Somehow I doubt you're rushing to my bed because of my willing personality. Part of him had expected her to immediately argue otherwise, but he was actually rather gratified when she didn't immediately do that, mostly because he would have known it was a lie. Even if his personality wasn't total dogshit, it wasn't like Ann had been provided with many opportunities to sample it. What with her riding herd in the militia, travelling to nearby villages, and him spending more time below ground than above. Honestly speaking, he'd had more conversations with Lynn than Ann. Ann shook her head. Mere minutes ago, it would be words like that would give rise to suspicions within me as to your true origins, Master. No man of the Empire would question why a female cultivator took a carnal interest in him. She eyed him, and for the first time Jack could see the embers of desire there. the same ones he often saw reflected in his own eyes.
It is simply the way of things. Male cultivators are a rare and valued resource. The opportunity to partake of one for an evening is one that any female cultivator of any worth will take advantage of as a matter of course.
Something like a smirk crossed the Catwoman's features.
After all, when might another opportunity to slake one's thirst present itself? She who fails to cast the rod will catch no fish.
She leaned forward once more, this time with rather more deliberate intent as she practically lounged across his desk.
Master, I do not know how things function beyond the Empire, but here we women have needs, and none other than a fellow cultivator might have the stamina and longevity to answer them.
Her gaze rested upon his helm.
I will be most gratified if you were to aid in fulfilling mine, not as my master, but as a man aiding a woman in most dire need.
Jack could fully admit that he was rock hard within his armor, a rather painful proposition given the limits of his cup, but he barely noticed that as his eyes traced across the delicate curve of Un's oh-so-kissable lips. God damn did he want her in that moment. And he knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that if he were to tear off her dress in that moment, she would do nothing to stop him, because she was just as horny and pent up as he was. If not more so, he thought absently. Of course, just as he was reaching across to act upon that very desire, reason chose to reassert itself. I will take it under advisement. There was no missing the moe of disappointment that issued forth from his student. Still, she didn't argue.
That is all I ask, master.
With that, she sashayed away, her hips rolling in time with the movement of her legs. As Jack watched her go, he felt like crying. Finally, as she stepped out of his office and the automatic door slid shut behind her, he ripped off his helmet and ran a hand through his hair. Christ, he muttered. How did it come to this? This shit wasn't supposed to be this complicated. He was supposed to have his own castle, be proclaimed God King, and have a harem of women at his beck and call right now. Instead, he was stuck in some hole in the ground, undergoing the longest dry spell he'd experienced since he turned 16. Hell, given the limitations his nanoforge imposed on him, he was working harder than he would have been if he was back in real space. Sighing in disgust, he turned his attention back to the project he'd been working on before Ann had shown up. It was nothing too fancy, just a means to hopefully adapt a modern nail guns magazine for use in his next generation of rifles. It was a work in progress. One that unfortunately needed to be given that rate of fire seemed to be the militia's current largest weakness. Almost of their own will, his eyes flitted back up to the monitor embedded into his desk, and the feeds from his home's various cameras contained therein. Ann was walking through the halls of his home as she made her way back up to the surface. She'd already lost the feminine way she'd adopted when she left his office. Instead, she was now walking with the much more familiar, indomitable march she usually used. Likewise, the almost teasing expression she'd been wearing had been replaced with her all-too-familiar omnipresent scowl. Still, she looked good, though. Damn good. Shaking his head, he turned his focus back to the gun project. Then back to Ann. Then back to the gun. Then the gun. Then Ann again. And stayed there. Computer, he said finally, run a search on blueprints for industrial level measuring devices.
Had you a tail? Would he be wagging?
Ann shot the dog an indignant glance, but didn't deign to reward her fellow cultivator with a response. She didn't miss the way the mortals around them subtly flinched away at the woman's words. Word of the pair's rivalry had not taken long to get around the town, and it seemed that everyone present was just waiting for it to come to blows. Or at least blows outside those exchanged in the two spars they'd had since the interloper had arrived in Jiangxi. Still worried as the members of the militia around them were as they went about their training, Ann couldn't help but derive some satisfaction from the fact that most of those present seemed to be on her side. Certainly she had no need for the support, moral or otherwise, of mortals, but it was still nice to have.
Master,
Ann called out as the man in question strode over to their section of the training yard.
Have you come to spar with us? Show us some new equipment?
Or had he perhaps come to a decision on her earlier offer? The Catwoman couldn't help the small shiver that ran through her at the thought. A shiver that repeated as she saw the way the man seemed to pause in his step at the sight of her. Once upon a time, she might have read movement like that as disinterest or even anger for her presumptiveness. Last night's revelation had changed her thoughts, though. Now she had some insight into her master's strange origins and thought processes. She saw his hesitance for what it was. Not something born of lack of interest, but rather the result of his desires battling with the strange customs of his home. And hadn't that been a revelation? Certainly she'd had her suspicions for some time, but it was still a shock to see them vindicated. Not just that her master hailed from beyond the Empire's borders, but that he was human. Perhaps if she had ever finished her journey and joined up with the Imperial Army, that might have been a concern for her. As a soldier of the Empire, she would have been obligated to confirm that this foreign man's interests did not run contrary to the Empire's, and how he had managed to get past the Great Walls. As it was, as a mere Imperial citizen, the obligations expected of her were only these she might otherwise expect of herself as a servant of the Empress. So long as her strange master's actions did not run directly contrary to the interests of the Empire, she was content to let things continue as they were. For the most part, she thought, eyes running up and down her master's massive armoured form, remembering those few occasions in which she'd had the opportunity to see the bare skin of the man inside. Not quite, her master said, as he strode up to where the pair of cultivators had been resting after their most recent spar.
Did you perhaps come to talk to me, then?
The dog had straightened up while Anne wasn't looking, somehow removing every crease from her dress as she did so, appearing as nothing less than a perfect Imperial lady.
If it's about my departure time, I should be ready to depart with your offer for the Overseer on the morrow, which is why I would be honoured if you would join me for a meal later this evening.
Anne would never admit it aloud, but she couldn't help the twinge of envy she held at the sight. While she was certainly no peasant, she nonetheless often found herself feeling like the country bumpkin the pampered princess named her as, since the other woman had shown up. She also couldn't help but scowl at the forwardness of the blonde hussy. I actually have a prior engagement with Anne here. Anne felt her ears shoot up, even as her heart jumped in her chest. Was this really happening? Was he really... Before that, though, before Anne's imagination could get the better of her, Master Johansson pulled some manner of strange device from his belt. I need her to squeeze this. Anne gave the strange thing a quizzical look before taking it in her hands and giving it a tender squeeze. Not just yet, Anne, her master instructed, shifting her fingers across the surface of the device until they were positioned against what she now realized were purpose-built handholds. Ones that gave just slightly under her soft grip. All right, squeeze now. She did, though not too hard, lest she break it. That was apparently the wrong answer, as her teacher's helmeted head turned to her. Harder, full strength. If you can break this, I want to know. He wanted her to break it. Why? Was it some new manner of building material? If so, why bother with the strange shape? Despite her confusion at the strange direction this meeting had taken, she nonetheless began applying more pressure to the device. Then more still, until eventually she was trying her level best to shatter the device in her hands. It didn't shatter, though, which honestly wasn't too much of a surprise. Her cultivation lent itself far more to speed and grace than raw power. Feats like bending steel with one's bare hands were best left to more powerful cultivators like her master, or to more specialized ones like the gorilla-fingered dog next to her. That's your full strength, right? Master Johansson said finally, though for whatever reason he sounded more relieved than disappointed. Was this metal really some manner of new building material? If so, she could understand why he might be glad it didn't shatter, even if some part of her was irritated that she lacked the power to do so. It is, Master. The man nodded before taking the device back. That's good. Real good. I was worried for a second there. Worried? She supposed that did mean he was setting the strength of the device rather than her. As she watched, the strange object was placed back on her master's belt, only for him to reach for the pack on his back and pull out an even stranger-looking device. Now I need you to squeeze this. At your command, Master. Still feeling confused, something echoed by the dog next to her, Anne took the object and got ready to do exactly that. Only to stop as the armored man stretched out a hand. No, not like that. I need you to use your thighs for this one. Her thighs? You might want to, well, line your back for it? Feeling a little odd, Anne nonetheless did as he asked. Lying down on the grass, she placed the strange object between her thighs, noting that what she had earlier assumed to be handholds were in fact to cup the curvature of her thigh, so she might more easily hold it. Is this some manner of training technique? The dog asked finally, as Anne started to squeeze down on the device with all of her might. It actually took her master a second to respond, seemingly distracted by something. Sort of?
Sort of,
Anne echoed. It's a measuring tool, for getting a better baseline of Anne's abilities, her raw strength and stuff like that. The dog hummed, her gaze turning to the device speculatively, which was a little embarrassing to be honest, given its position and Anne's own. Still, she couldn't help but feel some thrill at the idea that her master was finally testing her. Perhaps after having his secret revealed, some of the walls around his heart had crumbled. Thus, feeling less guarded, he was hoping to start training her more earnestly. Anne couldn't deny that the idea excited her, for as much as she had learned from his writings, battles with spirit beasts and latest spars with the militia, some part of her still yearned for the man himself to give her some one-on-one tutoring time. Perhaps that is what he intends for me tonight. It was a little funny how she found herself being a little conflicted on that front. Earlier she had hoped that meeting was intended for something more relaxing. Perhaps it still will, she supposed. Theirs would hardly be the first carnal entanglement to begin at the conclusion of a training session. So it was with that happy thought in mind that she continued to follow her master's orders, testing a number of strange new devices in a number of strange new ways. Such was her good cheer that even when the dog managed to butt and gain her own device, shattering it instantly, her smile refused to fail. And if later some of the militia chose to say that said smile came off more as a leer, well, she'd be happy to correct them.